Now that we went over the basics of how to handle values with nodes and also saw some procedural noises, we can start creating actual shapes and patterns from scratch. Shapes and patterns in general are the very foundation of most procedural shaders, so it is important to have a certain sense of how to handle them. Before, we have only been working with a single dimension. For shapes, we will have to use multiple dimensions. This is where it can get complicated easily. There are a couple of universal ways to generate shapes that I want to recommend and explain here. In general, what defines a shape are the lines that follow a constant value, and in particular the path where the value is 0. So manipulating gradients, depending on the location, is the best way to define shapes. When you have a gradient like simply the y component of a coordinate vector, we can easily create a straight edge by just using a math node set to greater than. That separates the areas below and above a certain value. Now it is time to introduce a second dimension and manipulate the profile of that edge. Let's grab the x component as well and combine it with the y component using a subtract operation. As you can see, the angle of the edge has changed. What happened is that the edge that we previously had is shifted depending on the x-coordinate. When I now manipulate that shift value with another math node, you can see that I get complete control over the resulting edge. But, as I've shown before, there are more methods to control values than just the math node. If, for example, I take an RGB curves node to manipulate the shift value, I get direct control over the resulting profile of the edge. But the RGB curves node operates in the range between 0 and 1. So the shape control is bound to this quarter of the plane here, where both used coordinates are in that range. But that can be changed by remapping the range of the values that are used. The easiest way to do that is using the map range node. We can just remap the x-coordinate that goes into the curves node from the range -1 to 1 of the object coordinate space to 0 to 1, where the curves node operates. Now we just have to remap the other coordinate the same way. But here I will use the math node set to multiply add and put both inputs to 0.5. That has the exact same effect as the map range node in this case. It is just using different inputs. But other than changing the range, there is another useful way of remapping the values that can be applied here. If I switch the multiply add operation with absolute, you can see that the shape is being mirrored to the other side. That works because the absolute operation flips all negative values around 0 to be positive, creating the same gradient mirrored like this. So you can think of using the absolute operation on incoming coordinates just as the mirror modifier. We will see similar analogies of operations in the following chapters. A useful way to generate approximately circular shapes is using polar coordinates. These, instead of giving you information about the position of a point on the x and the y-axis, are based on the distance to the origin, or radius, and the angle of the direction. There is an easy way to calculate these coordinates. You can get the angle by just simply using the arctan2 operation on the x and the y coordinate. You can see that this creates this circular gradient around the origin. But the resulting angle is in radians, where a full rotation is 2 pi. And here it goes from negative pi to positive pi, which is not that useful for us right now. But you can easily remap this to a range of 0 to 1 using the map range node. You can simply type in pi and minus pi. Blender knows how to translate this into a number. The radius is simply the length of the coordinate vector, which we can easily get with a vector math node. But we need to be careful here. This way, all 3 components are considered for the radius. What you usually want with polar coordinates is for the radius to be independent from the z component. That translates into cylindrical coordinates, opposed to spherical coordinates. So what I do for that is just to create a combine xyz node and grab only the x and the y component to detach the z component. Right now, we are only operating on a plane where the z component is 0, so it doesn't really matter. But when you're using a 3-dimensional coordinate space, it can be important to specify this. Now that we have the information about the radius and the angle, we can use that to generate circular shapes. That works just the same way as with the Cartesian coordinates x and y. Just manipulate the angle with an RGB curves node and subtract that from the radius. You can see that the shifting works a bit differently here. Now you can shift the distance of the edge from the center along the radius, depending on the angle. If you want the shape to be closed, you have to make sure that the starting point and the end point are both at the same level. Also with polar coordinates, it can be very useful to mirror the shape. Here I will just make sure that the angle starts in a negative range again by defining the mapping minimum as 0, so it ranges from -1 to +1, and then apply the absolute operation to that. And now we can create the shape more easily with the mirrored function. When I zoom in very closely in here, you can see the same stepping artifacts that I pointed out in a previous chapter on the procedural portrait. These are artifacts caused by using the RGB curves node. They don't appear when instead using only math nodes, for example. But the major benefit of the RGB curves node is that they are very intuitive and easy to use. Also, these stepping artifacts are very minor, and it is a valid option to use the RGB curves node when you just want simple control. A lot of the time, you don't actually want your shape to have a hard edge like that. So rather than using the greater than operation, you can just replace it with a subtraction. With that, we still have gradual information of the difference between both maps. To increase the hardness of this edge, you can just simply multiply the gradient by a factor. Then you can still clamp it to get a mask between 0 and 1. You can see that the length of this fade is not the same over the whole shape, and that is due to the way that the shape is created, and it depends on the slope of the curve that you use. You might think that it should be easy to just fade the edge by applying a blur operation, but due to the vector-based nature of the shading system, an operation like that is not at all that simple. I will touch on a workaround on that topic at the end of this chapter.